the penguin who walked 3,500 kilometers. November 1st, 2024, Ocean Beach, Denmark, Western Australia. Aaron Fowler was riding his ATV along the shore when he saw something that made no sense. A large bird, maybe a meter tall, waddling across the sand, black and white, moving with that distinctive penguin gait, upright, dignified, completely out of place. Aaron stopped the ATV, stared, because he knew what penguins looked like, and he also knew that penguins didn't live in Western Australia. The nearest penguin colony was in South Australia, over 2,000 kilometers away. And those were little penguins, tiny things, maybe 30 centimeters tall. This penguin was massive, almost as tall as a small child, moving with purpose across the beach like it owned the place. Aaron pulled out his phone and started recording. The penguin noticed him, turned, and kept waddling, not afraid, not aggressive, just there, existing in a place it had no business being. Within hours, the video was everywhere. Social media exploded. Wildlife experts were contacted. News outlets picked up the story, because this wasn't just any penguin. Based on its size and markings, this was an emperor penguin, a species that lives exclusively in Antarctica, in some of the most extreme conditions on Earth. And it was 3,500 kilometers from home. This is the story of Gus, the emperor penguin who somehow ended up on an Australian beach, alone, exhausted, impossibly far from where he was supposed to be. A penguin who became an internet sensation, a scientific mystery, and a symbol of something larger: climate change, animal resilience, the ways migration patterns are breaking down as the planet warms. But before he was a symbol, he was just a penguin, lost, trying to find his way home. Emperor penguins are not small birds. They're the largest penguin species on Earth, standing about 115 centimeters tall and weighing up to 45 kilograms. They live in Antarctica, breeding on sea ice during the brutal Antarctic winter when temperatures drop to -40 degrees Celsius and winds reach 150 kilometers per hour. They're built for extreme cold. Their feathers are densely packed, about 100 feathers per square inch, creating insulation that keeps them warm in conditions that would kill most other animals. They have a thick layer of blubber. Their metabolism is adapted to conserve heat and energy during months when food is scarce. Everything about emperor penguins is designed for Antarctica. They don't migrate north. They don't travel to temperate waters. They stay in the Southern Ocean, in the coldest waters on Earth, where they hunt for fish, squid, and krill in the deep ocean. The farthest north an emperor penguin has ever been reliably documented is the Falkland Islands, about 1,500 kilometers north of Antarctica. Even that's considered extraordinary, a rare vagrancy event, probably caused by a penguin getting caught in unusual currents and swept away from the colony. But Western Australia is 3,500 kilometers from Antarctica. It's across the Indian Ocean. It's in waters that are 15-20 degrees Celsius, far too warm for an emperor penguin. It's a place emperor penguins should never, ever be. And yet, on November 1st, 2024, there one was, waddling across Ocean Beach like it was the most normal thing in the world. The first people to respond were local wildlife volunteers. They contacted the Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions, DBCA, who sent wildlife officers to the beach. The officers arrived to find the penguin still there, sitting on the sand, looking exhausted. The penguin, later named Gus, after the town of Denmark where he'd appeared, was clearly in distress. He was underweight, dehydrated, and covered in sand. His feathers were matted. He wasn't moving much, just sitting, breathing heavily. Emperor penguins should weigh 30-40 kilograms. Gus weighed 23 kilograms. He'd lost a third of his body weight. Dr. Carol Biddulph, a wildlife veterinarian, was called in to assess him. She examined Gus carefully, checking his breathing, his temperature, his overall condition. Her assessment was grim. Gus was severely malnourished and dehydrated. He'd been traveling for a long time, burning through his energy reserves, unable to find the food he needed in waters that were too warm for the prey species he normally ate. "He's exhausted," Dr. Biddulph said. "He needs immediate care or he's not going to survive." The decision was made to take Gus into care. This wasn't simple. Emperor penguins are wild animals, protected under international treaties, and there's no established protocol for rehabilitating one that's shown up 3,500 kilometers from where it's supposed to be. But they couldn't just leave him on the beach to die. Gus was transported to a wildlife facility where he could be monitored, fed, and hydrated. The first challenge was temperature. Emperor penguins are adapted to extreme cold. The air temperature in Denmark, Western Australia, in early November was around 20 degrees Celsius. For Gus, that was dangerously hot. The facility set up a climate-controlled room, keeping the temperature around 10 degrees Celsius. They provided Gus with ice, with cold water, trying to give him an environment closer to what his body expected. Then came the question of food. Emperor penguins eat fish, specific species of fish that live in Antarctic waters. Those fish don't exist in Western Australia. The team had to source the closest approximations they could find: herring, pilchards, small fish that might approximate what Gus would normally eat. At first, Gus wouldn't eat. He'd been alone, stressed, disoriented. He didn't recognize the food, or maybe he was too exhausted to eat. Dr. Biddulph and her team tried everything: hand-feeding, leaving fish in the water, trying different species. Finally, after 3 days, Gus ate, a small amount at first, then more. His body remembered what to do. Meanwhile, scientists were trying to answer a more fundamental question: how did Gus get here? Dr. Belinda Cannell, a marine scientist from the University of Western Australia, began analyzing Gus's journey. Using ocean current data, penguin biology, and satellite imagery, she tried to reconstruct what might have happened. Emperor penguins are incredible swimmers. They can dive to depths of 500 meters. They can hold their breath for over 20 minutes. They can travel hundreds of kilometers in search of food. But they're not designed for long-distance migration across warm oceans. They're sprint swimmers, not marathon swimmers. They hunt in cold water where their prey is abundant. When they're traveling between breeding colonies and feeding grounds, they stay in Antarctic waters. So how did Gus end up in Western Australia? Dr. Cannell's theory: Gus got caught in an ocean current system called the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, which flows eastward around Antarctica. Normally, emperor penguins stay south of this current. But if a young penguin, Gus appeared to be a juvenile, maybe 1 or 2 years old, got disoriented or ventured too far north while hunting, he could get swept into the current. Once in the current, he'd be carried east. And if he tried to swim north, looking for familiar territory or following what he thought were the right signals, he'd end up moving farther and farther from Antarctica. The Antarctic Circumpolar Current eventually flows into the Indian Ocean. From there, other currents could have carried Gus north, toward Australia. It would have taken weeks, possibly months. Gus would have been swimming, hunting, trying to survive in waters that got progressively warmer and more hostile to his biology. Eventually, exhausted and starving, he would have seen land, the coast of Western Australia, and made for shore. Because even though it was the wrong shore, even though nothing about it was familiar, it was solid ground. A place to rest. A place to stop swimming. Dr. Cannell's analysis suggested Gus had traveled at least 3,500 kilometers from the nearest emperor penguin colony. Possibly much farther, depending on exactly where he'd started and what currents had carried him. It was an extraordinary journey, and it should have been impossible. But 2024 had been a strange year for ocean currents and Antarctic ice. Antarctica is changing. The continent is warming faster than almost anywhere else on Earth. Sea ice, The frozen ocean surface where emperor penguins breed is declining. In 2023, Antarctica experienced the lowest sea ice extent ever recorded. Breeding colonies that had been stable for decades were failing as ice broke up too early, before penguin chicks were ready to swim. Emperor penguins depend on stable sea ice. They breed on ice that needs to last from April through December, the entire Antarctic winter and into summer. If the ice breaks up too early, chicks drown. If it doesn't form at all, penguins can't breed. In recent years, entire colonies have experienced complete breeding failure. Thousands of chicks lost, adult penguins disoriented, unable to find the ice platforms they've been using for generations. And the ocean currents are changing too. Warmer water temperatures are altering current patterns. The Antarctic circumpolar current is becoming less stable. Eddies and unusual flow patterns are developing. For an emperor penguin, especially a young one, inexperienced, still learning to navigate, these changes create confusion. The ice isn't where it's supposed to be. The currents don't flow the way they used to. The signals that penguins use to navigate, temperature gradients, current patterns, ice formations, are all shifting. It's possible Gus wasn't lost. It's possible he was exactly where his instincts told him to be, but his instincts were based on an Antarctica that doesn't exist anymore. An Antarctica with different ice patterns, different currents, different temperatures. He followed the signals he knew, and they led him 3,500 kilometers from home. As Gus recovered in care, eating fish, gaining weight, regaining strength, people around the world became invested in his story. Social media was flooded with Penguin Gus updates. News outlets covered his progress daily. Children drew pictures of him. Adults argued about what should be done with him. The debate centered on a difficult question. Should Gus be returned to Antarctica, or should he be released locally? Returning him to Antarctica seemed like the obvious choice. That's where emperor penguins belong. That's where his species lives. But it's not simple. First, the logistics. Antarctica is 3,500 kilometers away. Getting Gus there would require a ship or a flight to an Antarctic research station, then transport to an emperor penguin colony. Emperor penguin colonies are remote, often on sea ice far from research stations. Delivering Gus to the right location would be extremely difficult and expensive. Second, the biology. Gus had been away from Antarctica for months. He'd been in warm water, eating unfamiliar fish, living in conditions totally unlike his natural habitat. Would he even know how to reintegrate with a colony? Would other penguins accept him? Or would he be rejected, left to die alone? Third, the ethics. Was it worth the enormous expense and effort to return one penguin to Antarctica when that penguin might not survive reintegration, and when the conditions that caused him to get lost, climate change, disrupted ice patterns, changing currents, were still present and getting worse? Some scientists argued Gus should be released off the western Australian coast. He'd found his way to Australia. Maybe he could survive here. Maybe he'd adapt. Penguins are resilient. Maybe he'd figure it out. But other scientists said that was essentially a death sentence. Emperor penguins are Antarctic specialists. They can't survive long-term in warm water. Gus might swim for a while, but without access to his normal prey, without the cold water his biology requires, he'd eventually die. Releasing him in Australia would just be letting him die slowly instead of quickly. The debate became public. People had strong opinions. Return him to Antarctica. Let him go in Australia. Keep him in captivity where he'd be safe. Everyone had an idea. Everyone thought they knew what was best for Gus. Meanwhile, Gus just kept eating fish and sitting in his climate-controlled room, unaware he'd become the center of an international debate about wildlife management, climate change, and human intervention in nature. By late November 2024, Gus had gained weight. He was up to 29 kilograms, still underweight for an emperor penguin, but significantly better than the 23 kilograms he'd been when found. He was active, alert, preening his feathers, swimming in the pool provided for him. Dr. Biddulph and her team made a decision. They would attempt to return Gus to the ocean, but not in Australia. They would transport him south, to waters closer to the Antarctic convergence zone, the boundary where cold Antarctic water meets warmer subantarctic water. It wasn't Antarctica, but it was much colder than Western Australia. It was water where Gus might find familiar prey, where his biology would function properly, where he'd have a chance. On November 20th, 2024, Gus was loaded into a specialized transport crate and taken aboard a research vessel. The plan was to sail southwest for several days, reaching the coldest water they could access, then release him. The voyage took 5 days. During that time, Gus was monitored constantly. He was fed, kept cool, given ice to regulate his temperature. He seemed calm as a penguin 3,500 kilometers from home can be. On November 25th, the vessel reached the release point, approximately 500 kilometers southwest of Western Australia, in water that was 8 degrees Celsius, still warmer than Antarctic water, but cold enough that emperor penguins had occasionally been spotted this far north. The crew lowered Gus into the water. He floated for a moment, orienting himself. Then he dove, disappeared beneath the surface. He surfaced 30 meters away, looked back at the boat, then dove again. That was the last time anyone saw Gus. We don't know what happened to Gus after he was released. He wasn't tagged. Emperor penguins are difficult to tag, and the stress of additional handling was considered too risky for a bird who'd already been through so much. There are several possibilities. Possibility 1, he survived. He swam south, following the cold currents, gradually making his way back toward Antarctica. Maybe he found other emperor penguins. Maybe he reintegrated with a colony. Maybe he's alive right now, somewhere in the Southern Ocean, hunting fish, completely unaware that millions of humans spent weeks worried about him. Possibility 2, he died. The journey was too much. He was too weak. He couldn't find enough food. He swam for days or weeks, and eventually his energy ran out. His body is somewhere at the bottom of the Indian Ocean, another casualty of a changing climate and disrupted migration patterns. Possibility 3, he's still out there alone, swimming, hunting, surviving but not thriving, unable to find his way back to Antarctica but able to sustain himself in the cold subantarctic waters. A solitary emperor penguin, the farthest north any of his species has ever lived. We'll probably never know, and that uncertainty is hard for people. We want endings. We want to know that Gus made it home, that the story has a happy conclusion, that our intervention made a difference. But nature doesn't provide those endings. Animals don't send postcards. Penguins don't file status reports. Gus is gone, into the ocean, into the unknown, hopefully toward Antarctica, possibly toward death, definitely toward a future we can't see or control. The story of Gus matters for reasons beyond one lost penguin. It's a story about climate change made visible, made personal, made impossible to ignore. Abstract data about sea ice decline doesn't generate the same emotional response as a penguin showing up 3,500 kilometers from where it should be. Statistics about warming oceans don't create the same urgency as watching a severely malnourished emperor penguin sitting on an Australian beach, clearly in the wrong place, clearly suffering. Gus made climate change concrete. He was evidence that animal migration patterns are breaking down, that the signals animals use to navigate are becoming unreliable, that species adapted to specific conditions are being pushed into environments where they can't survive. He was also evidence of something else, that nature is resilient in ways we don't fully understand. Gus survived a journey that should have killed him. He swam 3,500 kilometers through progressively warmer water, burning through his energy reserves, and he made it to land. He didn't die at sea. He didn't give up. That's extraordinary. That's a penguin pushed beyond every biological limit of his species, and he kept swimming. It's also tragic, because Gus should never have had to make that journey. Under normal conditions, with stable ice patterns and reliable currents, he would have stayed in Antarctica. He would have grown up in his colony, learned to hunt in the Southern Ocean, eventually bred and raised chicks of his own. Instead, he ended up alone on an Australian beach, 3,500 kilometers from home, an accidental ambassador for a planet in crisis. In the months after Gus's release, his story continued to resonate. News articles were written, scientific papers published, educational materials created for schools. Children who'd never thought about Antarctica or climate change or penguin migration patterns were suddenly asking questions, suddenly caring about a bird they'd never meet. That's the power of a single story. One penguin, one journey, one impossible arrival on a beach where penguins should never be. It's easier to care about Gus than to care about emperor penguin populations declining due to sea ice loss. It's easier to imagine one penguin swimming alone than to conceptualize thousands of breeding failures across Antarctica. Stories make abstract problems concrete. They give us something to hold on to, something to care about, someone to root for. Gus became that story for millions of people. The penguin who walked 3,500 kilometers. The penguin who survived the impossible. The penguin who might, maybe, hopefully, find his way home. And even if we never know what happened to him, even if his story ends in uncertainty, he changed something. He made people pay attention. He made climate change feel real and urgent and personal. One penguin, one journey, one reminder that the world is changing faster than animals can adapt, that migration patterns developed over millions of years are breaking down in decades, that the stable systems that allowed life to flourish are becoming unstable. Gus walked 3,500 kilometers to tell us that, and we should listen. Because somewhere in the Southern Ocean right now, there are thousands of emperor penguins trying to navigate a world that no longer makes sense, trying to find ice that isn't there, trying to follow currents that have shifted, trying to raise chicks on platforms that break up too early. Most of them won't swim 3,500 kilometers to an Australian beach. Most of them will die quietly, unnoticed, unreported. Their stories won't go viral. Their journeys won't make headlines. But they're all Gus. They're all lost. They're all trying to survive in a world that's changing too fast. Gus just happened to wash up where someone could see him, where someone could help, where his story could be told. The rest are still out there, still swimming, still lost, still trying to find their way home.